Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Tonight we're talking about a plant, a humble, sage green, completely unassuming little leaf that has been used for centuries by Mazatec shamans in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, to commune with the divine, and that somehow ended up being filmed, uploaded and watched by millions of teenagers in their bedrooms between the years 2005 and 2012. We are talking about Salvia divinorum, the world's most potent naturally occurring hallucinogen, and the genuinely bizarre, genuinely historical, genuinely baffling chapter of internet history in which an entire generation discovered it on YouTube. Not from a doctor, not from a shaman, from a guy named Brandon LOL88 who filmed himself on a webcam wearing a backwards cap, took one hit, stared at his ceiling fan for 4 minutes, and then uploaded it with the title Salvia Trip. Gone wrong, not clickbait. It absolutely was clickbait, but also it absolutely went wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. I want to give a genuinely warm, heartfelt thank you to the person who suggested this topic. You know who you are. Topics like this one, weird, funny, historically real and somehow completely overlooked, are exactly what this channel is built on, and I would not have found it without you. Suggestions like yours are what shape this channel into something worth showing up for. And speaking of showing up, we are now on Spotify. If you want to listen while you fall asleep without the screen, the link is in the description. Go find it. It's there. I put it there myself. Now. Dim those lights. Turn on a fan if you got one. That soft white noise is going to carry you through this. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. And before we go any further, let's just pause and ask some questions that I genuinely want you to think about. Did you ever wonder what it's like to feel like you've been turned into a piece of furniture? Did you ever wonder what a 500-year-old indigenous healing ritual looks like when it's been filtered through a 15-year-old in New Jersey with a flip phone and a can of Mountain Dew? Have you ever considered what the Mazatec people of Oaxaca, who have carefully, reverently, spiritually used this plant for generations, must have felt when they learned that their sacred medicine was trending on the internet? Did any of these teenagers tell their parents? Did any of them tell their parents' parents? Did anyone at any point stop and ask whether maybe, just maybe, the world's most powerful hallucinogen was not the ideal thing to try alone in your childhood bedroom while your mum was downstairs making chicken nuggets? No, they did not. Congratulations, you've just logged onto the early internet. The year is 2006. Your dial-up modem has just finished screeching. YouTube is barely a year old. And somewhere in the high-altitude cloud forests of southern Mexico, a small green plant is about to go viral in the most chaotic way possible. Let's talk about the plant itself. Before the videos, before the smoke shops, before the news segments with red fonts and alarming background music, there was just a leaf growing quietly in the mountains. Deep in the Sierra Mazateca, a range of mist-covered mountains in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca, there grows a plant that almost no one outside of a very small, very specific indigenous community had ever heard of. Salvia divinorum. The name translates, roughly, to sage of the diviners, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously it was taken. It is a member of the mint family, which is exactly as anticlimactic as it sounds, and it grows in clusters of tall green stalks with large, soft leaves in the damp, shadowy ravines of the cloud forest. For centuries it was used exclusively by the Mazatec people in healing ceremonies called veladas, nighttime rituals conducted in darkness, guided by a curandera, a healer, most famously a woman named Maria Sabina, whose name will come up again. The plant was consumed by chewing the fresh leaves slowly, or by drinking a preparation made from them. The effect was powerful, disorienting, and deeply spiritual, a temporary dissolution of ordinary reality that, in the right context, with the right guidance, was used to diagnose illness, commune with the spirit world, and heal. The Mazatec did not do this recreationally. They did not film it. They did not upload it. They did not caption it. Wait for it. Now, if you're picturing a dramatic-looking plant, something gnarled and ancient, oozing mystery, maybe with thorns and an ominous glow, stop right there. Salvia divinorum is deeply, almost insultingly ordinary in appearance. It looks like a large basil plant that has been eating well. The leaves are broad and soft, a gentle green, slightly fuzzy to the touch. The flowers, when they appear, are small and white. It smells faintly herbal. If you walked past it in a garden, you would not give it a second glance. You would think, some kind of herb, and move on with your life. This is, in hindsight, one of the more remarkable things about it, the sheer modesty of its presentation given the absolute chaos contained inside its leaves. It is the botanical equivalent of a quiet co-worker who turns out to be a former Navy SEAL. You had no idea. Nobody had any idea. The cloud forest where it grows is itself a world apart. Imagine the Sierra Mazateca on a cool morning. Thick mist rolling through the trees, the air heavy with moisture and the smell of wet earth and moss, the light filtering down through the canopy and long green shafts. It is the kind of place that feels, even without the plant, slightly outside of ordinary reality. The Mazatec built their lives in these mountains, farming corn and beans on steep terraced slopes, speaking a tonal language that sounds almost like music, maintaining a relationship with the natural world that was older than any written record anyone had thought to keep. They were not isolated in the sense of being cut off from the broader world entirely, but they were far enough from it, and different enough from it, that a plant growing in their ravines could remain essentially unknown to outsiders for centuries. The Velada ceremony, the healing ritual in which Salvia divinorum was used, was not a casual occasion. It was called for specific reasons: a persistent illness, a crisis of the spirit, a question that needed answering from the other side of ordinary experience. The healer, the curandera, would prepare carefully. The participants would prepare carefully. The setting was controlled, the darkness intentional, the silence maintained. The chanting of the curandera throughout the ceremony was not background music. It was a guide, a thread, a way of holding the space open and navigating what the plant revealed. Every element of the ceremony existed for a reason developed over centuries of careful, cumulative knowledge. This was not guesswork. This was not content creation. This was medicine. And then the internet arrived, and the medicine became something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just hold the image of that plant, growing quietly in its damp ravine, completely unaware of what was coming. It had survived centuries of obscurity with its dignity intact. The early 2000s were going to be a lot to process. Let's talk about the chemistry, because here is where things get genuinely interesting, and by interesting I mean pharmacologically terrifying, in a way that, looking back, makes the entire YouTube era feel like a very avoidable situation. The active compound in Salvia divinorum is called salvinorin A, and it holds the distinction of being the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogen ever identified by science. Not one of the most potent, full stop. To give you a sense of scale, LSD, which most people think of as an extremely powerful substance, is active in doses measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. Salvinorin A is active in doses of 200 micrograms or less, meaning a quantity roughly the size of a few grains of salt is enough to send a fully grown adult into a complete and total dissociation from consensus reality within 30 seconds. It works by binding to kappa opioid receptors in the brain, a completely different mechanism from every other classic hallucinogen, which is part of why the experience it produces is so unusual, so difficult to describe. and so consistently terrifying to people who are not expecting it. And in the early 2000s, almost nobody who was expecting it was also the person filming themselves trying it in their childhood bedroom. Now, the kappa opioid receptor system is not a part of the brain you probably spend a lot of time thinking about. Most people are more familiar with the mu opioid receptors. Those are the ones that painkillers work on, the ones that produce warmth and relief, and, in higher doses, the profound sedation that makes opioids both therapeutically useful and devastatingly addictive. The kappa system is different. It is distributed across brain regions involved in sensory processing, emotional regulation, pain perception, and, crucially, the construction of what researchers call the sense of self, the continuous, coherent, first-person narrative of being you, the part of your brain that knows you are sitting in a chair, in a room, on a planet, in a life that has a past and a future and a general shape. When kappa opioid receptors are strongly activated, that narrative doesn't just get distorted, it gets replaced. This is the key thing. This is the detail that separates Salvia divinorum from almost everything else people were putting in front of cameras in the early 2000s. Other substances altered the experience of reality. Salvia divinorum swapped it out. Users did not see colours more vividly or feel euphoric or become talkative and warm. They left completely. For 2 to 10 minutes, they were somewhere else, somewhere that followed its own rules, populated by its own logic, convincingly real in a way that made the bedroom and the camera and the friend holding the camera feel, to the person experiencing it, like a dream they were just now waking up from, or possibly like something they had invented, or possibly like something they had always been and were only now remembering. The reports vary. The disorientation, however, is consistent. There is also the matter of speed. When Salvia divinorum is smoked, which is how virtually all of the YouTube videos were filmed, the onset is not gradual. It is not the slow, building warmth of a glass of wine, or even the 30 to 60 minute ramp of a psilocybin mushroom. It is 15 to 60 seconds. You take the hit, you hold it, you exhale, and then you are somewhere else. The transition is so fast that many users report not experiencing a transition at all, just a discontinuity, like a cut in a film, between sitting in the chair and wherever they ended up next. This is extremely dramatic on camera. It is also extremely dangerous without a sober person present, because in those 2 to 10 minutes of complete disorientation, a person has no reliable ability to keep themselves safe. They are for the duration entirely elsewhere. The chair they were sitting on has, from their perspective, ceased to be a chair. Whether they remain in it is largely a matter of luck. All of this was documented. All of this was available to read in careful detail on harm reduction websites, in trip reports, in Daniel Siebert's extensive guides. The information existed. The teenagers uploading videos to YouTube had simply not read it. This is not, unfortunately, a surprising outcome. This is just what happens when the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogen known to science becomes legal, cheap, and available by overnight shipping to anyone with a credit card. Let's slow down for a moment, because before we spend any more time on the chaos, it is worth spending some time on the knowledge, the deep, careful, centuries-old knowledge that existed long before anyone pointed a webcam at a glass pipe. Before a single teenager in Ohio ever heard the word salvia, the Mazatec people of Oaxaca had been working with this plant for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years, possibly longer, though the written record only takes us so far. They did not stumble onto it. They did not dare each other to try it. They developed an entire framework of practice, ritual, and preparation around it, because they understood, perhaps not in the language of neuropharmacology, but in the deeply practical language of experience, that this was not a plant you approached casually. Ceremonies were conducted at night in complete darkness and silence. The healer, almost always a woman, would chant and pray throughout. The person receiving the healing would lie down, be covered with a blanket and stay quiet. The point was not entertainment. The point was not content. The point was healing, the treatment of specific ailments, the resolution of specific crises, the restoration of a person's relationship with the forces the Mazatec understood to govern health and illness. The Mazatec word for these healers is curandera, literally one who cures, and the title carried weight. A curandera was not simply someone who had tried the plant and decided to charge admission. She was someone who had spent years, often decades, learning the ceremonial protocols, the songs, the prayers, the specific ways of holding the space so that the person undergoing the experience did not become lost in it. Think of it as the difference between handing someone a scalpel and calling them a surgeon versus the actual decade-long training process that produces an actual surgeon. The plant was the instrument, the curandera was the practitioner, the ceremony was the operating theatre. Remove any one of those elements, and you do not have medicine. You have something considerably less predictable. The Velada itself, the nighttime healing ceremony, was a carefully structured event. It typically took place in the healer's home, in complete darkness, with all external sounds minimized as much as possible. The person seeking healing would have prepared beforehand. Fasting, abstaining from certain activities, approaching the experience in a spirit of seriousness and intention. The curandera would prepare the plant, fresh leaves chewed slowly and held in the mouth, or a preparation drunk from a cup, and then begin her chanting. The chants were not decorative, they were functional. They guided the experience, named the spirits being called upon, and provided a continuous thread of human sound that the person undergoing the healing could orient themselves by, like a rope lowered into a well. Without the rope, you are just in the well. The Mazatec also understood through centuries of accumulated experience that the plant was not appropriate for everyone, or for every occasion. It was reserved for specific circumstances. It was not used recreationally. It was not used by people who are mentally or emotionally destabilized. It was not used by children. These were not arbitrary rules. They were the distilled wisdom of generations of healers who had watched what happened when things went well and what happened when they did not, and who had developed their protocols accordingly. The knowledge was sophisticated. It was just not written down in a format that a teenager browsing YouTube in 2007 would think to look for. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the noise of the viral era, the sheer depth of the knowledge that existed and the completeness with which it was ignored. The Mazatec had solved centuries ago the central problem that the YouTube era kept stumbling into over and over again. How do you create a context in which this extraordinarily powerful experience is navigable, useful, and safe? The answer they arrived at involved darkness, silence, guidance, preparation, community, and a trained human being holding the space throughout. It was not a perfect system, but it was 1,000 years in the making, and not a single element of it made it into the videos. Let's talk about the moment it all began to unravel. Because the story of how Salvia divinorum and Mazatec healing practices more broadly became known to the outside world is, at its core, a story about one woman and one journalist with very questionable judgment. And it is a story that casts a long shadow over everything that followed. The story of how the outside world found out begins not with salvia specifically, but with the mushrooms, the psilocybin-containing mushrooms that the Mazatec also used in their healing ceremonies, and which would become the first point of contact between their tradition and the wider world's curiosity. In 1957, a banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson travelled to the Sierra Mazateca specifically to seek out what he had heard rumours of: indigenous mushroom ceremonies. He'd been corresponding with botanists and anthropologists for years, piecing together references to sacred mushroom use in pre-Columbian texts and colonial-era documents. He was, by his own account, genuinely passionate about the subject. He meant well. He found the ceremonies, and he found the woman who conducted them, a curandera named Maria Sabina, who agreed, after some persuasion, to allow him to participate in a velada. What happened next was not great. Wasson went home and wrote about the experience in Life magazine, one of the most widely read publications in America, under the headline Seeking the Magic Mushroom. He described the ceremony in vivid detail. He described the effects of the mushrooms in vivid detail, and he published Maria Sabina's full name, her photograph, and the name of her village. The article reached millions of readers in a single week. Within years, a flood of Western seekers descended on the Sierra Mazateca. Hippies, researchers, curious thrill seekers, spiritual tourists, and eventually Timothy Leary, who would take what he learned there and transform it into a cultural movement that bore essentially no resemblance to its source. Maria Sabina's life was, by her own account, ruined. Her community, which had kept the ceremonies private for centuries, turned on her for what they saw as betrayal of sacred knowledge, even though the betrayal had been Wasson's, not hers. Her house was burned down. She was ostracized. She died in poverty in 1985, having watched the tradition she had devoted her life to become, in the hands of outsiders, something she no longer recognized. Before her death, she gave an interview in which she described what the influx of Western visitors had done to the ceremonies. From the moment the foreigners arrived, she said, the holy children lost their purity. They lost their force. They ruined them. From now on, they will not work. This is the origin story of Western interest in Mazatec plant medicine, and it is not a proud one. Wasson did not set out to cause harm. He was genuinely captivated by what he experienced, genuinely believed he was sharing something important with the world. But the effect of his article was to strip a sacred practice of its context and offer it to an audience of millions who had no framework for receiving it, an audience who experienced it as novelty, as exotic spectacle, as a story about getting high in the jungle. The parallels to what would happen 50 years later on YouTube are, in retrospect, almost uncomfortably exact. The medium was different. The plant was slightly different. The outcome, sacred knowledge extracted, decontextualized and consumed as entertainment, was essentially the same. Salvia divinorum itself remained largely unknown through all of this. It would take another few decades, a few dedicated researchers, and an internet connection to bring it to the same crossroads, but the path had been cleared. And the lesson, that context is not separable from the medicine, that you cannot lift a practice out of its tradition and expect it to land safely, had already been written in Maria Sabina's life, for anyone who cared to read it. Let's move forward a few decades. The mushroom ceremonies are now famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask. Timothy Leary has come and gone. The summer of love has come and gone. The war on drugs has been declared, expanded and declared again, and Salvia divinorum is still, for the most part, quietly growing in its cloud forest ravines known to the Mazatec, known to a handful of botanists who had documented it in field surveys, and essentially unknown to everyone else. For a few decades after Wasson's article, Salvia divinorum remained largely unknown to the general public, known mostly to a small, specialized community of ethnobotanists, researchers, and the kind of serious-minded psychedelic explorers who read dense academic journals and corresponded with each other through the mail. The plant was first formally described to Western science in 1962, partly through the work of Albert Hofmann, the same Swiss chemist who had synthesized LSD in 1943, which is either a remarkable coincidence or the universe having a very specific sense of humour about who gets to discover what. Through the 1970s and 80s it remained obscure, mentioned in a few specialist publications, grown by a few collectors, whispered about in the corners of conferences that were themselves already on the fringes of mainstream science. Ethnobotany, the study of the relationships between people and plants, particularly in indigenous and traditional cultures, was itself a field that existed somewhat at the margins during this period. It attracted brilliant, eccentric, genuinely passionate researchers who were willing to spend months in remote regions, learning languages, building relationships with communities, and documenting knowledge that the broader academic world was not always particularly interested in. People like Richard Evans Schultes, the Harvard botanist who spent decades in the Amazon cataloguing plant medicines, and whose work would eventually influence an entire generation of researchers, writers, and curious individuals who found his books in libraries and could not put them down. These were the people who knew about Salvia divinorum before the internet. They treated it with seriousness, with appropriate caution, and with a respect for the tradition it came from that the YouTube era would largely abandon. The internet changed this, slowly at first, then all at once. By the mid-1990s, early online communities, Usenet groups, nascent websites, early harm reduction forums had begun discussing Salvia divinorum in earnest. People were sharing trip reports, careful, detailed, often lengthy first-person accounts of what the experience was actually like, written with the sober analytical tone of people who had done serious preparation and were attempting to contribute usefully to a shared body of knowledge. They were sharing growing instructions, because the plant could be cultivated outside of its native range if you were careful about humidity and light, and they were sharing vendor information, because by the mid-90s, a small number of specialty botanical suppliers had begun offering dried Salvia divinorum leaf and, eventually, extracts for sale by mail order. These early adopters were, for the most part, adults with a studied interest in psychedelics, a baseline of caution, and at least a passing familiarity with the concept of set and setting. The idea, popularised by Timothy Leary and later developed much more carefully by researchers like Stanislav Grof, that the context in which you have a psychedelic experience shapes the experience itself as profoundly as the substance does. They were not always perfectly careful, but they were trying to be careful. They were reading each other's reports. They were developing norms. They were building, piece by piece, a community of practice, imperfect, informal, entirely self-organised, but genuinely attempting to engage with this extraordinary plant in a way that honoured its power. They were not filming themselves. Not yet. That would require a platform that didn't exist yet, a distribution system for human spectacle that was still several years away from being built. But the groundwork was laid. The plant was known, the extracts were available, the information was online, and the teenagers were, without knowing it yet, about a decade away from finding all of it. Let's talk about the law, or rather, let's talk about the absence of it, because the legal status of Salvia divinorum in the early 2000s is one of those facts that, when you say it out loud, sounds like something you made up to win an argument. Here is a fact that, in retrospect, seems almost designed to cause chaos. In the United States, as of the early 2000s, Salvia divinorum was completely legal at the federal level. It was not a scheduled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. It was not regulated by the FDA. It was not restricted in any way. You could buy it online, have it shipped to your house, and use it in your living room without breaking a single law, at least until individual states began passing their own restrictions, which happened gradually and patchily over the following decade. The reason for this is basically bureaucratic timing. Salvia divinorum was not widely known when the Controlled Substances Act was being written in 1970, and by the time it became visible enough to attract regulatory attention, the process of scheduling a substance was slow, politically complicated, and generally reactive rather than proactive. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Controlled Substances Act actually does. When a substance is placed on Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs considered to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, it becomes illegal to possess, manufacture, or distribute at the federal level. Simple possession can carry prison time. Research becomes extremely difficult, requiring special licenses and DEA oversight. The practical effect is to remove a substance from ordinary life very thoroughly and very quickly. Schedule 1 currently includes heroin, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and MDMA, substances with wildly different risk profiles lumped together by a scheduling process that has been criticised by researchers for decades for being driven more by politics than by pharmacology. Salvia divinorum, despite being pharmacologically more disorienting than all of them, was simply not on the list. Nobody had gotten around to it. The DEA was aware of the plant. They listed it as a drug of concern in 2003, which is bureaucratic language for "we're watching this, please behave," but didn't move to schedule it federally. This decision, or non-decision, left Salvia divinorum in a genuinely unusual position. A substance powerful enough to completely remove a person from ordinary reality for 10 minutes, available for overnight shipping from a Botanical supply website, legal to possess and use in the majority of the country, with no age restriction, no dosage guidance requirement, and no regulatory framework of any kind. It sat in that position for the entire window of the YouTube era. The timing was, from a public health standpoint, genuinely unfortunate. From a historical standpoint, it is absolutely fascinating. It is the kind of regulatory gap that only opens up when a substance is sufficiently obscure for long enough, and then becomes famous too fast for the system to respond. Individual states began filling the gap, but slowly and inconsistently. Louisiana passed a ban in 2005. Delaware, Missouri, and Tennessee followed in the years after. By 2012, roughly half the states in the country had some form of restriction. In the other half, you could still walk into a smoke shop and buy it off a shelf next to the lighters and the incense. The result was a patchwork so uneven that the same plant could be a felony on one side of a state border and a freely available consumer product on the other. This is not an unusual feature of American drug law, which has always been a negotiation between federal authority and state autonomy conducted at the expense of clarity. But, in the case of Salvia divinorum, the gap between the most and least restrictive states was particularly stark, because the substance at the centre of it was particularly powerful. You are not talking about a slightly different threshold for marijuana possession. You are talking about the world's most potent natural hallucinogen being legal to sell to a 14-year-old in one state and a felony in the next. Welcome to the American regulatory system. Mind the step. Let's go inside the smoke shop. Because before YouTube made Salvia divinorum famous to millions, there was a quieter, more local distribution network doing the same work in a slightly less spectacular fashion, and it smelled like patchouli and had a glass case full of pipes near the register. Before YouTube made Salvia divinorum famous, there was a quieter, more local distribution network doing the same work in a slightly less spectacular fashion. The smoke shop. Head shops, glass stores, niche botanical suppliers, these businesses began stocking Salvia divinorum products, typically in the form of dried leaf or extracts, which were dried leaves coated with a concentrated preparation of the active compound, available in a dizzying range of potencies labelled with numbers like 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, and for reasons that defy every principle of harm reduction, 60x. These products sat on shelves next to incense, rolling papers, and decorative pipes, often marketed with the kind of deliberately vague legal language that has long been a feature of the smoke shop industry. Not for human consumption, sold as incense, for novelty purposes only, Nobody was buying it for incense. The person ringing you up at the counter knew that. You knew that. The cardboard display holding the little foil packets knew that. The extract potency labelling system deserves its own moment of attention, because it is one of the more remarkable examples of completely unregulated consumer communication in recent memory. A 5x. Extract meant that the dried leaf had been treated to concentrate the active compound to roughly 5 times the potency of plain dried leaf. A 10 times was 10 times. A 20 times was 20 times. A 60x was theoretically 60 times the potency of plain leaf, a concentration so far beyond anything resembling a beginner's dose that researchers who study the substance would read that number and immediately sit down. These potency ratings were not standardized. They were not verified by any third party. They were not accompanied by any guidance about what, practically speaking, the difference between a 5x and a 20x experience might feel like, other than, broadly, the difference between being briefly confused and briefly convinced that you've always been a lamp. The label said not for human consumption on the front and listed the potency multiplier on the back, and that was the entirety of the information provided. The smoke shop culture around Salvia divinorum in those years occupied a strange middle space between the earnest harm reduction community that had grown up online and the absolute chaos of the YouTube videos. The shops were not, for the most part, actively trying to harm their customers. They were selling a legal product. Many of them would, if asked, tell you something about the substance, that it was strong, that you should start with a low potency, that you should have someone with you. Some of them had printed information available. But the commercial incentive was also clearly present, because the higher potency extracts were more expensive, and the customers most likely to buy the highest potency product were also the least likely to be the kind of careful, experienced users for whom it was theoretically intended. This is not a criticism unique to smoke shops selling Salvia divinorum. It is a tension that exists in any market where the most dangerous version of a product is also the most profitable one. By the mid-2000s, online vendors had largely taken over from physical shops as the primary source for Salvia divinorum products, offering a wider range of potencies, bulk quantities, and the convenience of delivery to your door in plain packaging. The online market was, if anything, even less regulated than the physical one. Price comparisons were easy, reviews were posted, forum discussions linked directly to vendor pages. The entire ecosystem, the harm reduction information, the trip reports, the vendor listings, the product reviews, existed in one connected digital space, which meant that a curious teenager could, in a single afternoon, go from not knowing what Salvia divinorum was to having a package of 60x extract on its way to their house. The foil packet would arrive in the mail, the disclaimer would still say not for human consumption, and somewhere a webcam was about to get turned on. Let's set the scene, because the world that Salvia divinorum went viral in did not exist 10 years earlier and would not have produced the same result 5 years later. The timing was, in the way that truly consequential accidents always are, almost impossibly specific. YouTube launched in February of 2005. Within 18 months, it was the fastest growing website in the world. By 2006, it was serving more than 100 million video views per day. The platform was, from the beginning, a place for ordinary people to upload whatever they wanted: home videos, skateboarding tricks, lip-sync performances, and, it would turn out, footage of themselves taking powerful psychoactive substances in front of a webcam and then being completely unable to function for 4 minutes while their friends screamed with laughter in the background. The convergence of YouTube's rise and Salvia divinorum's legal status, low cost and easy availability, was not engineered by anyone. It was not a marketing campaign. It was an accident of timing so precise it almost feels like satire. To understand why YouTube specifically mattered, Why this couldn't have happened on a written forum or a photo sharing site, you have to understand what video does that text cannot. A trip report written on Erowid, however vivid and carefully detailed, cannot show you what it looks like when a person leaves. It can describe the experience from the inside. It cannot show you the outside, the 4 minutes of a person sitting in a chair, eyes open, completely absent, while the room around them continues normally. That image is what the YouTube videos captured, and it was, for an enormous number of viewers, completely unlike anything they had seen before. It was immediate, it was short, it was shareable, and it answered the single most compelling question in the entire history of human curiosity about altered states. Yes, but what does it actually look like? The platform's design amplified this naturally. Videos were short. YouTube's early upload limit was 10 minutes, which was several minutes longer than a typical Salvia experience anyway. They were easy to share via links that were just becoming a standard part of how people communicated online. They appeared in search results alongside each other, creating a browsable library of similar content that made it easy to watch one and immediately watch 30 more. And they had comment sections, which we will discuss at length shortly, that created a community around the content and gave every video the feeling of a shared experience rather than a private one. You were not watching alone. You were watching with thousands of other people, many of whom were also watching for the first time, all of whom had opinions they were typing in real time. The creators uploading these videos were not, for the most part, thinking of themselves as participants in a cultural moment. They were thinking about views. The early YouTube economy ran entirely on attention. Monetization came later, and even then only for larger channels. What people were chasing in 2006 and 2007 was simply the experience of being watched, of sharing something that made other people react, and Salvia videos made people react reliably and extremely. The comment-to-view ratio on these videos was, by the standards of the platform, unusually high. People could not simply watch and move on. They had to say something. They had to ask questions. They had to type "doing this tonight" or "this is why I don't do drugs," or most commonly a string of capital letters that expressed an emotion for which no punctuation had yet been invented. The algorithm noticed. The algorithm served more of the same, and the feedback loop, once started, ran for years. Let's watch a video, or rather let's describe what it was like to watch one for the first time, because encountering this content in 2006 or 2007, before you knew what you were looking at, was itself a genuinely disorienting experience. The first wave of Salvia trip videos on YouTube were not polished. They were not well lit. They were not narrated with context or preceded by responsible disclaimers. They were, almost universally, shaky webcam footage of young people, usually between the ages of 15 and 25, sitting in desk chairs or on bedroom floors, taking a long hit from a glass pipe packed with dried salvia leaf or extract, and then, within 30 to 60 seconds, experiencing what can only be described as a complete departure from the planet. What made these videos so compelling and so widely shared was the speed and totality of the effect. Other drug videos had appeared on the internet before, but nothing quite captured an audience like watching a fully conscious, coherent, conversational human being take one deep breath, and then, within the time it takes to exhale, become someone who has apparently forgotten that walls exist. The setting was almost always the same: a bedroom, a desk, a computer monitor visible in the background, sometimes a poster on the wall. The lighting was whatever the overhead bulb provided. The camera was either a webcam built into an early laptop or a handheld digital camera, held by whoever had drawn the short straw of staying sober. The pipe was glass, usually small, the kind sold in smoke shops alongside the Salvia products themselves. The extract was almost always the high-potency variety, because why would you film yourself doing anything less? The hit was always large, held as long as possible, because they had read, or more likely heard from someone who had read, that you had to hold it in for the full effect. What happened next was the part that made people share the video. The person would exhale. There would be a pause, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes closer to a minute, during which they would look from the outside exactly like a person waiting for something to happen. And then it happened. The eyes would change. First, not in any dramatic physical way, but in the quality of attention behind them, which would shift from present and curious to somewhere entirely else in the space of a single breath. Then the body, a confusion of movement, a reaching for something that wasn't there, a standing up that wasn't quite standing, a sitting back down that wasn't quite intentional. Sometimes they laughed, a laugh that bore no relationship to anything funny, a laugh that was more like a report from a country that doesn't share a border with comedy. Sometimes they spoke, fragments of sentences, single words, observations delivered with great urgency about things that were not, from any observable standpoint, present in the room. And then, somewhere between 2 and 10 minutes after it started, it ended. The eyes came back. The face reorganized itself into something recognizable. The person looked around the room with the specific expression of someone who has just returned from somewhere and cannot quite believe where they left from. And then, almost always, they said one of 3 things. That was the craziest thing I've ever experienced. Or, I'm never doing that again. Or most poignantly, reaching for a glass of water with slightly unsteady hands. Can I have some water? These videos spread because they were short and dramatic and immediately legible even without context. You did not need to know anything about pharmacology or Mazatec tradition or kappa opioid receptors to understand what you were watching. You were watching a person leave and come back. And that, it turned out, was riveting. Let's break it down. Because once you had watched enough of these videos, and in 2007 and 2008, a lot of people watched a lot of them. A pattern emerged that was so consistent it almost felt scripted. The experiences varied wildly. The format almost never did. If you watched enough Salvia videos, and in 2007 and 2008, a lot of people watched a lot of Salvia videos, you began to notice that they followed a remarkably consistent format, almost as if the experience itself had a script. Step 1. A young person, usually male, usually in a bedroom or basement, addresses the camera with the energy of someone who has absolutely no idea what is about to happen to them, despite having just watched 47 videos of other people in this exact situation. Okay, so we're trying Salvia for the first time, they say, in a tone of cheerful confidence that will, within 90 seconds, be unrecognizable. There is often a brief explanation of where they got it, how much they paid, and what potency extract they're using, details delivered with the calm authority of someone who has done absolutely no preparation, but has done quite a lot of Googling. Step 2 is the hit, and here the format is remarkably standardized. A large bowl, packed well, a deep breath held for as long as possible. This technique, maximizing the dose, holding it in, was passed around the early forums as the correct method for achieving the full effect. It was not wrong exactly. It was just the kind of advice that looks different in the context of a supervised, intentional experience versus the context of a bedroom in New Jersey at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. The person takes the hit. They hold it. The camera zooms in slightly, instinctively, the way cameras always zoom in when they sense something is about to happen. Everyone in the room goes quiet. Step 3 is the onset, which is where the format begins to diverge slightly from person to person, but only slightly. Some people look surprised, some look confused, some look briefly and profoundly peaceful, like someone who has just remembered something they forgot a very long time ago. Some look like they have just been informed of something genuinely alarming. All of them, within 60 seconds, are no longer making eye contact with the camera in any meaningful sense. The lights are on. Nobody is home. The friend holding the camera makes noise. The person does not respond in the way that people respond to noises. Step 4 is the peak, which is the part that generated the views. 2 to 10 minutes of a person being, from every external indicator, completely somewhere else. The range of behaviours during this phase is wide. Some people sat very still, eyes open, silent, in a way that was somehow more unsettling than movement. Some people talked continuously, in complete sentences, about things that had no relationship to the room they were in. Some people stood up and tried to move through the room in ways that suggested the room's layout was, from their perspective, entirely different from its actual layout. Some people laughed. Some people cried briefly, with the quick completeness of someone processing an emotion at a speed that ordinary life does not permit. And some people appeared to forget completely and sincerely that they were a person. Not that they were a person in a specific room on a specific night, that they were a person at all. Step 5 was the return, the slow reassembly of ordinary selfhood from whatever it had scattered into. This was, in its own way, as compelling as the peak. Watching the specific process by which a human being reclaims themselves, recognizes the room, recognizes the people in it, recognizes with a kind of quiet astonishment that they are sitting in a chair holding a pipe and there is a camera pointing at them, and apparently they said some things. What did I say? Was, by some margin, the most common question asked in step 5. Was that normal? Was the second. The answer to both, broadly, was yes. This was normal. This was what it looked like. And millions of people were watching, sharing, commenting, and in many cases deciding, with a confidence that the format itself seemed to encourage, to try it themselves. Which brings us to the comment section. Let's talk about the comment section. Because if the videos were the main event, the comment sections were the anthropological archive, a living, breathing, occasionally unhinged record of exactly how an entire generation processed something they had absolutely no framework for. Beneath every Salvia video of the era, and there were thousands of them, a small civilization had formed, complete with its own language, its own hierarchy, and its own furious internal debates. There were the veterans who posted long, earnest explanations of proper dosage and technique, usually beginning with, "I've been working with this plant for years and what you're doing is dangerous." These comments were detailed, carefully written, and routinely ignored. They sat at the bottom of the thread like a responsible adult at a party nobody invited them to, watching events unfold with increasing dismay. They had read Siebert's guidelines. They had read Erowid. They had opinions about set and setting. Nobody was asking then. There were the skeptics, who accused every video of being fake, a position that became harder to maintain the more of them you watched, and yet never fully disappeared. Clearly acting, someone would type beneath footage of a person trying to have a conversation with their own left hand. My friend did this, and it doesn't work like that. These comments were a reminder that the internet has always contained a significant population of people whose response to any extraordinary thing is to immediately insist it is not happening. Then there were the thrill seekers who left comments like "doing this tonight, wish me luck, LMAO," sometimes followed up hours later by replies that read simply, "Update, do not do this." These comment threads had the structure of a very short story: setup, action, consequence, moral. They were among the most read comment threads on the platform during those years, in the same way that people slow down near accidents, not because they want to see something bad, but because narrative tension is irresistible, and "doing this tonight" followed by a long silence followed by "okay." So that was a mistake is a complete dramatic arc in 3 lines. There were the philosophers, who had apparently had profound experiences and were determined to describe them at length in a 500-word comment that began, "Okay, so I know this sounds crazy, but..." and then proceeded to describe. with genuine earnestness, the dissolution of the self and the nature of consciousness and the feeling of having always existed and never existed simultaneously. These comments were sometimes moving. They were sometimes rambling. They were almost always typed without paragraph breaks, which made them look, visually, like a wall of distress. There were the parents, and this is the most poignant category. Parents who had found the videos while looking up their children's search history, or who had been directed there by a concerned teacher, or who had simply stumbled across them while trying to understand a conversation they had overheard. Their comments were easy to identify because they used punctuation correctly and referred to YouTube as this website. They asked questions that nobody in the comment section was equipped to answer. They were worried in a specific quiet way that the rest of the comment section, which was primarily running on bravado and Mountain Dew, did not quite know what to do with. The comment section, as a cultural document, is irreplaceable. It is a time capsule of exactly how a generation encounters something genuinely strange for the first time, in public, with no adult supervision and a character limit. It is funny and sad and occasionally wise, and mostly a reminder that the internet gives everyone a microphone at the exact moment they least need one. Let's spend some time on what was actually happening, because the videos show the outside of a Salvia divinorum experience with great clarity, but they showed nothing of the inside, which is where the real story was. In the interest of accuracy, because this channel takes historical truth seriously, even when it is dressed up in comedy, it is worth spending some time on what Salvia divinorum actually does to the people who use it, based on the extensive documented record available in research literature, harm reduction archives, and yes, YouTube. Unlike classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, which tend to produce an enhanced, often beautiful, sometimes difficult version of ordinary reality, Salvia divinorum produces something qualitatively different. A complete replacement of ordinary reality with something else entirely. Common themes in trip reports include the sensation of being divided into multiple selves, of merging with objects or surfaces, of travelling through time, of being trapped in a repeating loop, of encountering entities or presences, and, most distinctively, of completely forgetting that one has taken a substance and believing utterly and, without question, that whatever strange world one is currently inhabiting is simply the world. This last feature is the one that distinguishes Salvia divinorum most sharply from other substances in the pharmacological landscape. With LSD or psilocybin, even in high doses, most users retain some awareness, however thin, however strained, that they have taken something, that they are in an altered state, that the experience will eventually end. This awareness is sometimes called the observer, the part of the mind that watches the experience even while being consumed by it. With Salvia divinorum, the observer frequently disappears, not retreats, disappears. Users report returning to ordinary consciousness with no memory of having been in an altered state at all, only a discontinuity, like a gap in a film reel, between sitting in the chair and wherever they were next. They were not experiencing an altered version of their life. They were experiencing a different life entirely, and they had no idea the first one existed. The content of the experience varies enormously from person to person and from occasion to occasion, but certain themes recur with enough frequency to suggest something about the underlying neurology. The sensation of being pulled sideways, not forward or backward but laterally, out of one's ordinary position in space, is extremely common. The sense of repetition, of having been in this moment before and of being in it again and again in a loop, appears in perhaps a third of all documented trip reports. The experience of merging with a surface, a floor, a wall, a piece of furniture, and temporarily losing the boundary between self and object is common enough to have its own entry in Siebert's taxonomy. And the entities, presences encountered during the experience, sometimes benevolent, sometimes indifferent, sometimes possessing what users describe as an alien familiarity, as if they are beings that have always existed just outside the range of ordinary perception and that the plant has temporarily made visible. All of this lasted, when smoked, between 2 and 10 minutes, which sounds brief. But the reports consistently describe those minutes as feeling much, much longer, sometimes hours, sometimes what felt like entire lifetimes compressed into a few hundred seconds. The return to ordinary reality was, for most people, accompanied by a kind of stunned gratitude that ordinary reality existed at all. Your bedroom, your chair, your friend's face, all of it suddenly precious in the specific way that things become precious when you've briefly had no access to them. This is, in the best cases, a genuinely meaningful experience. In the worst cases, it is simply terrifying. And the difference between the two, as the Mazatec healers had understood for centuries, had almost everything to do with context, which is the one thing the YouTube era consistently failed to provide. Let's talk about the moment everything changed, because, for all the thousands of anonymous videos that had been circulating through the internet for years, there was one moment that catapulted Salvia divinorum from niche internet curiosity to national news story, and it arrived, as these moments so often do, completely unexpectedly and involving someone nobody had predicted. For all the thousands of anonymous videos that circulated through the internet's early years, there was one moment that catapulted Salvia divinorum from niche internet curiosity to national news story, and it arrived in December of 2010 in the form of a leaked video of a very famous 19-year-old. The footage, which spread across the internet within hours of its leak, showed Miley Cyrus, at the time still best known as the star of Hannah Montana, and one of the most recognizable teenagers on the planet, at a birthday party, smoking from a bong and exhibiting what her representatives would later describe as behavior consistent with Salvia divinorum use. The clip had been filmed by someone at the party and sold to a tabloid. Within 24 hours it had been seen by millions of people. Cable news ran segments, morning shows ran segments, parents called radio shows, members of Congress issued statements about the dangers of legal highs. The DEA was asked for comment. Billy Ray Cyrus, Miley's father, tweeted that he was so sad, a response that managed to be both entirely sincere and somehow the most 2010 sentence ever written. And across America, teenagers who had never heard the word salvia before typed it into Google, found the videos, found the smoke shops, and made their own decisions, which is, historically speaking, almost exactly what happens every time a substance gets this kind of media attention. The coverage was not, for the most part, nuanced. It was not interested in the Mazatec tradition, or the pharmacology, or the regulatory gap that had allowed the substance to be legally available at all. It was interested in the celebrity, the scandal, and the two words that were catnip for every headline writer in America, legal and hallucinogen, placed next to each other in a way that suggested the combination was somehow a failure of governance rather than a predictable outcome of the scheduling process. Legal drug used by Teen Star was the frame. The fact that the substance had been legal and available and widely used by teenagers for years before Miley Cyrus was filmed with it was not in the coverage particularly prominent. What the Miley Cyrus moment illustrated, more than anything else, was the particular mechanism by which drug panic spread in the media age. A substance does not need to become more dangerous to attract more attention. It needs to attach itself to a story that already has an audience. Miley Cyrus had an audience of tens of millions. Salvia divinorum suddenly attached to that audience became visible to people who had never encountered it, including, critically, the legislators who'd been moving slowly on the question of whether to restrict it. In several states, the video was cited in the legislative debates that followed. the same substance, the same pharmacology, the same risk profile, but now it had a face, and the face was famous, and the machinery of American moral panic, which runs on celebrity and outrage and cable news segments with alarming fonts, had everything it needed to operate at full speed. Let's talk about the panic. Because the media coverage of Salvia divinorum in the late 2000s and early 2010s was, even by the standards of American drug coverage, a particularly vivid example of how attention and information are two entirely different things. In the years between 2006 and 2012, there was a recurring pattern. A concerned parent, having discovered either the videos or the foil packets in their child's room, contacted a local news station. The local news station ran a segment. The segment featured alarming footage of teenagers having extreme reactions, intercut with interviews with alarmed experts and titles in large red font reading things like "legal and dangerous" or "the new teen drug craze," or, most memorably, "Salvia." What every parent needs to know tonight. These segments were, by the standards of local news, not inaccurate. The footage was real, the reactions were real, the legal status was real. But they also functioned, as drug panic segments almost always do, as advertising. Every time a news station in Iowa or Florida or Arizona ran a story about teenagers using Salvia divinorum, they created an audience of teenagers in Iowa or Florida or Arizona who had just learned about Salvia divinorum for the first time. Researchers who study media and drug trends have a name for this phenomenon. It is called the forbidden fruit effect, and it is extremely well documented, and local news stations continue to produce these segments anyway, which says something about either the limits of institutional learning or the irresistibility of a good alarming headline, or possibly both. The comment sections beneath the news station's YouTube upload of the very segment, warning about Salvia divinorum, would, within hours, fill with comments from teenagers saying, "I had no idea this existed, trying it this weekend." The expert interviews that accompanied these segments were their own small drama. Toxicologists and emergency physicians were asked to comment on a substance that, in clinical terms, had a relatively limited profile of serious adverse effects. It was not physically addictive. It did not cause organ damage, it cleared the body quickly, and the acute risk was primarily behavioural rather than pharmacological. This made it genuinely difficult to convey as a public health crisis in the conventional sense, which meant that the coverage had to work harder to convey danger, leaning on the vividness of the video footage, the potency numbers, and the word hallucinogen, which carries a weight in American public discourse that has more to do with the 1960s than with pharmacology. The experts did their best. The chirons did not help them. What the panic produced in practical terms was a faster timeline for state-level bans than might otherwise have occurred, a brief and significant increase in demand among the demographic the coverage was trying to warn, and a national conversation about legal highs that was conducted almost entirely without reference to the people who'd been using the substance carefully and responsibly for centuries. The Mazatec healers did not appear on local news segments. Their framework for understanding and working with a plant was not presented as a model. The story, as told by American media, was about danger and regulation, and celebrity and teenagers, a story with a clear villain, a clear victim, and a clear solution that involved legislation. It was, in that sense, a very American story about a very un-American plant. Let's follow the lawmakers, because the legislative response to the Salvia divinorum panic was, even by the standards of American drug policy, a particularly striking example of what happens when urgency outpaces understanding. As the panic grew, state legislatures began to act. Louisiana was among the first, passing a ban on Salvia divinorum in 2005, before the YouTube era had even fully begun, based largely on a proactive concern about legal highs rather than a documented local crisis. Delaware, Missouri, and Tennessee followed. By 2012, roughly half the states in the country had passed some form of restriction, some banning the plant outright, some banning only the sale to minors, some including it in broader synthetic drug legislation that grouped it with substances it had nothing to do with. Salvia divinorum is not synthetic, it is a plant. Including it in legislation primarily aimed at synthetic, cannabinoids, substances manufactured in laboratories and designed to mimic the effects of marijuana, was, pharmacologically and botanically, a category error. But legislative categories are driven by political convenience as much as scientific precision, and legal substances that make teenagers act strangely on YouTube was a coherent enough political category to legislate against, even if it was not a coherent scientific one. The patchwork that resulted was bewildering from almost any angle. In some states, possession of Salvia divinorum was classified as a Schedule 1 offence, the same category as heroin, carrying potential prison time. Directly across the state line, it was still sitting on a smoke shop shelf with a novelty label. The federal government continued to decline to schedule it, meaning there was no national standard, no consistent enforcement, and no clear signal about what the legal status of the substance actually was to someone trying to understand it from the outside. Researchers studying the plant for potential medical applications, and there were some working in universities and private laboratories on questions about addiction and depression and the kappa opioid receptor system, found themselves in an increasingly impossible position, where the substance they were studying was Schedule 1 in some states, completely legal in others, and subject to a federal regulatory framework that had not definitively classified it either way. The legislative debates themselves were in many cases genuinely interesting, as documents of how societies make decisions about substances in real time. Some legislators came to the hearings with a clear position and used the expert testimony to support it. Others were visibly wrestling with the information they were receiving, trying to reconcile the pharmacological reality, a short-acting, non-addictive plant hallucinogen with a limited profile of serious adverse effects, with the political reality of constituents who had watched the news segments and were frightened. A few legislators, a small number, asked questions about the Mazatec tradition and the research potential of the compound. These questions were rarely the ones that shaped the outcome of the vote. The votes were shaped by the footage, and the footage was unambiguous, even if the pharmacology was not. A person leaving their body on camera is a powerful argument for a ban, whatever the nuances underneath it. The nuances did not make the evening news. Let's take a moment for the quiet ones. Because in every Salvia video that went viral for the chaos it contained, there was usually one person in the frame who was not the story. The person holding the camera, or sitting slightly off to the side, calm and watchful, making sure nothing went badly wrong. These people deserve their own segment. Not every Salvia video from the era was simply a person going completely to pieces while their friends watched from a safe distance. Some of them featured a quieter, more careful presence. Someone who had read the forums, done the research, and taken it upon themselves to serve as what the harm reduction community calls a tripsitter. A person who stays sober, stays present, and makes sure that whoever is having the experience does not hurt themselves or wander into traffic. These tripsitters were, in the context of the videos, often the most compelling figures on screen. The calm person with a hand gently on a shoulder, while their friend talks in complete sentences to a corner of the room. The one who says you're okay, look at me, you're okay, with a patience and steadiness that, frankly, most trained professionals would struggle to match. The harm reduction community had been advocating for trip-sitting for years. Erowid had pages dedicated to it. Siebert's guidelines mentioned it. The Mazatec healers had been doing it in a much more sophisticated, ritualized form for centuries. The curandera who guided a Veleda ceremony was, among other things, a professional tripsitter, someone whose entire role was to hold the space, to stay present, to provide a continuous human anchor for the person undergoing the experience. The tripsitter in the YouTube videos was an informal, improvised version of this ancient role. Usually a friend who had agreed to stay sober that night, armed with none of the training or ritual knowledge of a curandera, but possessed of the same basic impulse: to be present, to be steady, to make sure the person came back. What made the good trip-sitters visible in the videos was precisely their restraint. While other friends in the room might laugh, or make noise, or film closer than was comfortable, the trip-sitter stayed level. They spoke in low, even tones. They did not startle. When the person on the substance stood up unexpectedly, the trip-sitter was already moving to be beside them. When the person said something confused or frightened, the trip-sitter responded with calm rather than amusement. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Watching someone you know completely leave their ordinary personality for 10 minutes and not knowing exactly when or how they're coming back is, in practice, an experience that requires genuine steadiness, the kind that does not come automatically, and that the comment section, which treated these videos as entertainment, rarely acknowledged. The trip-sitters of the Salvia era were, in a small but genuine way, doing something important, maintaining a thread of human care inside a cultural moment that had largely abandoned it. They were the part of the tradition that survived the translation from ceremony to bedroom, stripped of all context except the essential one, that someone should be present, sober, and paying attention. The Mazatec healers, watching the videos from the other side of centuries, might have recognized that part. Not the pipe, not the camera, not the bedroom with the band posters, but the hand on the shoulder. That part they would have understood. Let's step away from the videos for a moment and into the laboratory. Because while teenagers were filming themselves and legislators were drafting bans, a small number of scientists were doing something different and considerably quieter and considerably more careful and considerably less watched. While teenagers were filming themselves and legislators were drafting bans, a small number of scientists were doing something different, trying to understand what Salvia divinorum and its active compound actually did, and whether that knowledge might be useful. The discovery that salvinorin A worked through kappa opioid receptors, a completely distinct mechanism from all other known hallucinogens, made it pharmacologically interesting in ways that went far beyond recreation. Research published in peer-reviewed journals through the 2000s explored its potential relevance to mood disorders, addiction, and pain management. Some studies suggested that kappa opioid receptor activity might play a role in depression. Others looked at salvinorin A's unusual pharmacokinetics, how quickly it worked, how completely it cleared the body, as potentially useful properties for a therapeutic compound. The addiction research was particularly intriguing. Studies in animal models suggested that kappa opioid receptor agonists, compounds that activate the same receptors as salvinorin A, could reduce self-administration of cocaine in rats. If this translated to humans, it would represent a genuinely novel mechanism for treating stimulant addiction, which remains one of the most treatment-resistant areas of addiction medicine. There are no FDA-approved medications specifically for cocaine addiction. A compound derived from a plant that the Mazatec had been carefully working with for centuries, operating through a completely distinct neurological pathway, might offer something that the existing pharmacological toolkit did not. This research was preliminary. Animal models do not always translate to humans. The pathway from interesting result in rats to approved medication is long, expensive, and uncertain. But the signal was there, and the researchers following it were serious people doing careful work. The problem was the regulatory environment. As state bans accumulated and the DEA maintained its drug of concern designation, without moving to schedule the substance federally, the practical conditions for research became increasingly complicated. Researchers working with salvinorin A or its derivatives needed to navigate a patchwork of state and federal regulations that varied depending on where their laboratory was located. Funding was difficult to secure because the political environment around the substance had been shaped by the news segments and the legislative debates rather than by the scientific literature. Grant reviewers who associated Salvia divinorum with YouTube videos of teenagers were not, as a category, enthusiastic funders of research into its therapeutic applications. The science was not wrong. The science was simply very difficult to do in a climate that had decided what the substance was before the research had a chance to say. This is a familiar story in the history of psychedelic research. LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, all of these substances were being studied for legitimate medical purposes before cultural panic and legislation made that research nearly impossible for decades. The research did not disappear. It went underground, or it went to other countries, or it waited. The researchers who believed the science was worth pursuing kept publishing, kept presenting at conferences, kept writing grant applications that were mostly rejected, and kept hoping that the cultural moment would eventually shift enough to make the work possible again. In the case of salvinorin A, that shift has been slow, but the science is still there, patient and specific in the journals, waiting. Let's go back to Oaxaca, because the people at the centre of this story, the people whose plant this actually was, had not gone anywhere. They had simply not been asked. It is worth pausing here to consider how the Mazatec people, whose plant this is, whose tradition this is, whose healers developed the entire framework of its use over centuries, experienced the period of Salvia's internet fame. The short answer is, not well. The longer answer involves a pattern of extraction and disregard that the Mazatec had already lived through once, with the mushroom ceremonies that Wasson publicised in 1957, and that the Salvia viral era repeated with different technology, and essentially the same result. The spiritual and cultural significance of Salvia divinorum to the Mazatec was not, in the YouTube era, a topic that featured prominently in the comment sections or the smoke shop marketing materials or the local news segments. The plant was discussed almost entirely in terms of its effects on the Western teenagers who were using it, not in terms of where it came from, what it meant, or what was being lost in the translation. The Mazatec relationship with Salvia divinorum was not simply they used this plant. It was a relationship embedded in an entire cosmological framework, a way of understanding the world, illness, healing, and the relationship between human beings and the forces that govern their lives that had been developed over centuries and that the plant was one part of. You cannot separate the plant from the framework any more than you can separate a word from the language it belongs to. Outside the framework, the word makes noise but no meaning. The plant, outside the ceremony, outside the darkness and the guidance and the preparation and the intention, produces an experience. But the experience without the framework is just a thing that happened to you. It does not tell you anything. It does not heal anything. It is at best interesting. At worst, it is frightening. At worst of all, it is filmed and uploaded and commented on by people who found it funny. Anthropologists and cultural commentators who were paying attention during the viral era noted this with dismay. The people who had the most knowledge about how to use the plant safely and responsibly were the least consulted. Their expertise was not sought by the smoke shop vendors writing product descriptions. It was not sought by the legislators drafting bans. It was not sought by the local news stations producing segments. It was not sought by the YouTube users uploading videos. The Mazatec healers existed, had always existed, were available in principle to be consulted, and were simply not part of the conversation, because the conversation was not about them. It was about us. It was about what this plant did to Western teenagers in bedrooms in 2007, and what should be done about that. The people who had spent centuries developing an answer to that question were nowhere in the frame. This is not a new observation. It is one that has been made in different contexts about the relationship between indigenous knowledge and Western cultural consumption many times before. The Salvia era did not invent this dynamic. It illustrated it with unusual clarity, because the contrast was so stark. On one side, 1,000 years of careful, cumulative, context-rich knowledge about a specific substance. On the other, a foil packet labelled not for human consumption and a comment section. The Mazatec had solved the problem. Nobody who needed the solution thought to ask them. Let's be honest. Because this story has been told so far with a certain amount of dark comedy, the videos, the comment sections, the legislation, the foil packets, and all of that is real, and all of it is genuinely absurd. But there was another side to it, and it would be wrong to leave it out. The vast majority of salvia trips, however chaotic they appeared on film, did not result in lasting harm. The experience was short, the substance left the body quickly, and the long-term health profile of Salvia divinorum, unlike many other substances, did not appear to include physical dependence or significant toxicity. But the vast majority is not all, and there were cases where things went genuinely wrong. People who were not supervised fell, or walked into furniture, or went outside. People with underlying mental health conditions, particularly those with personal or family histories of psychosis, had severe adverse reactions that in some cases required hospitalization. There were reports of extended disorientation, dissociation that lasted beyond the expected window, and profound psychological distress that persisted for days after the experience itself had ended. The relationship between Salvia divinorum and pre-existing mental health conditions was, and remains, one of the areas of greatest legitimate concern. The kappa opioid receptor system plays a role in regulating mood and stress responses, and strongly activating it in someone with a fragile or unstable baseline can produce outcomes that are qualitatively different from what the same experience produces in someone psychologically stable. This was known. It was documented in the harm reduction literature. It was listed as a contraindication in Siebert's guidelines. It was simply not information that travelled effectively in the direction of the people who most needed it, the ones who had found the substance through the videos rather than through the forums, who had no awareness of the guidelines, and who did not know their own mental health history well enough to know they should be cautious. There was also the physical environment. A person completely dissociated from ordinary reality, with no awareness that they are in a room with furniture and hard edges and potentially open windows, is a person who can hurt themselves in the most ordinary ways, falling off a chair, walking into a door. The tripsitters who were present in some videos caught these moments before they became injuries. The people who tried it alone, in the privacy of their bedrooms, had no such safety net. The videos that showed the chaos were the ones that got uploaded. The ones that went quietly and privately wrong were not filmed, or not uploaded, or existed only as private memories that nobody discussed publicly. The true injury rate of the Salvia divinorum viral era is not known, because there was no reporting mechanism, no clinical database, no systematic way of collecting the information. What is known is that emergency rooms in states where the substance was commonly used saw a small but measurable increase in presentations related to it during the peak years. Small in clinical terms, not small if it was you. Let's talk about the machine. Because the human appetite for spectacle is old, but the technology that could serve it at industrial scale was new, and in the case of Salvia divinorum it made a significant difference. In the early years of YouTube, the platform's recommendation algorithm was relatively simple compared to what it would later become, but it was already doing what recommendation algorithms do, serving users more of what they had just watched. If you watched one Salvia video, the sidebar filled with more Salvia videos. If you watched one in 2007, You were, within minutes, watching 10, then 20, then 50, a library of them, organised into informal series by the same uploaders, building audiences and subscriber counts, and the early architecture of what would eventually become influencer culture. The channels that posted Salvia content regularly were among the fastest growing on the platform in those years. They were not monetized yet. That would come later. They were driven by something more basic, the human appetite for novelty, for spectacle, for the question what would happen if answered in 4 minutes of grainy footage and a comment section that functioned as a real-time audience. What the algorithm was doing in technical terms was optimizing for engagement, for watch time, for clicks, for comments and shares. And Salvia videos were, by those metrics, extraordinarily engaging. They were short enough to watch in one sitting. They were dramatic enough to produce an immediate reaction. They were similar enough to each other that watching one created an appetite for more. You wanted to see if the next person's reaction was the same, or different, or more extreme. The algorithmic logic that served these videos to new audiences was the same logic that drives all recommendation systems. If you watched this, you will probably want to watch that. It was not malicious. It was not aware of what it was doing. It was simply a mathematical function applied to human behaviour at scale, and at scale its effect was significant. The spread of Salvia, divinorum on YouTube, was therefore not entirely organic in the way that word-of-mouth spread is organic. It was partially engineered, not by any person or any intention, but by a system designed to maximise attention, applied to content that happened to be maximally attention-grabbing. This distinction matters because it changes the nature of the phenomenon slightly. It was not just that teenagers were curious about an unusual substance. It was that a technological system was actively, continuously, efficiently connecting curious teenagers to content about that substance, without any mechanism for also connecting them to the harm reduction information, the Mazatec context, or the research literature that might have given the curiosity somewhere more useful to land. The algorithm served the spectacle. The context arrived, if at all, in the comments. And in the comments, as we have already established, the veterans with the careful advice were losing the attention war to the person who had just typed "doing this tonight, wish me luck," LMAO. This was not a problem unique to Salvia divinorum. It was a preview of a problem that would define the next 2 decades of internet culture. The attention went to the spectacle. The consequences went elsewhere. And nobody had yet figured out how to change that. Let's talk about the people who were trying to help. Because somewhere between the foil packets and the comment sections and the local news segments, there was a community of people who had spent years carefully building a body of knowledge about how to engage with this substance more safely, and who spent the viral era watching that knowledge get ignored at industrial scale. Throughout the Salvia viral era, the harm reduction community, the network of researchers, activists and organisations dedicated to reducing the dangers associated with drug use without necessarily calling for abstinence, was in a state of particular frustration. They had spent years carefully building a body of knowledge about Salvia divinorum, how to use it more safely, how to choose an appropriate setting, how to dose conservatively, how to prepare mentally and physically, how to recognise when someone was not in a good position to have the experience at all. All of this information existed. It was on Erowid. It was in Siebert's dosage guidelines. It was in the trip reports that the serious early community had spent years accumulating and annotating. And then teenagers started posting videos of themselves doing the exact opposite of all of it. Maximum dose, no sitter, no preparation, bedroom setting, webcam running, and those videos got millions of views, and the harm reduction content got, by comparison, very few. The Erowid website, which had been the primary online repository for psychedelic harm reduction information since the mid-1990s, had extensive Salvia divinorum documentation, a vault of trip reports, a pharmacology page, dosage guidelines, warnings about interactions with mental health conditions, links to Siebert's work, and a general tone of serious, careful engagement with the substance as something that warranted respect rather than spectacle. It was thorough, it was accurate, it was written by people who cared deeply about the safety of the people reading it, and it was formatted like a reference library, because that is what it was, which meant that in the attention economy of YouTube circa 2007, it was losing the engagement war to a grainy video of a teenager trying to eat their own sleeve. This is not a criticism of Erowid, or of the harm reduction community, or of the people who wrote the guidelines. It is a structural observation about the relationship between information and attention. Information that is careful, qualified, and presented in text form competes poorly in a visual medium optimized for emotional reaction against content that is immediate, dramatic, and requires no prior knowledge to engage with. The harm reduction community understood this. They talked about it. Some of them tried to adapt, creating video content, writing shorter summaries, using the comment sections of the viral videos to post safety information. These efforts were genuine and largely ineffective, not because the information was wrong, but because the platform was not built to reward caution. It was built to reward spectacle, and in that environment, the most responsible voices were also, almost by definition, the least visible ones. What the harm reduction community was experiencing during the Salvia era was a preview of a problem that would define the next 2 decades of public health communication on the internet. The consistent structural disadvantage of nuanced information in a media environment that optimizes for emotional engagement. They were not wrong. They were simply quiet. And in the early years of YouTube, quiet was not a viable strategy. Let's follow the money, because underneath the viral videos and the legislative panic and the harm reduction community's exhausted commentary, there was a very simple commercial story playing out, and it looked, for a few years, like an extremely good business. The viral spread of Salvia divinorum on YouTube had a direct and measurable effect on the market for the substance. Sales of Salvia products through online vendors and smoke shops increased significantly through the late 2000s, driven in large part by the visibility the videos provided. Vendors who had previously sold modest quantities of dried leaf to a niche clientele of botanically curious adults suddenly found themselves fielding orders from teenagers who had just watched a video and wanted to try it themselves. The customer base had changed, the product had not, and the gap between the two, between a substance developed for careful adult use with guidance and a market now primarily driven by teenagers chasing the experience they had seen on YouTube, was one that the commercial infrastructure was not particularly well equipped or particularly motivated to address. New products appeared with the demand. Higher potency extracts, combination products, and novelty packaging emerged as the market matured. The naming conventions became more dramatic as the competition increased. Products with names that emphasized extremity and power rather than the careful, graduated language of the harm reduction guides. The 60x extract, which had been at the outer edge of what responsible vendors offered, was joined by products marketed with even more aggressive potency claims. Some of these claims were accurate, some were not. The potency labeling system was unregulated and unverified, and a 60 times extract from one vendor might be pharmacologically very different from a 60 times extract from another. The person buying it had no reliable way of knowing. The label said 60 times. That was the information available. Online vendors operated in the same legal grey zone as the physical shops, but with greater reach and lower visibility. A vendor selling Salvia divinorum products from a warehouse in a state without a ban could ship to customers in states that did have bans. relying on the practical difficulty of enforcing drug laws against mail-order botanical products. Some vendors included harm reduction information with their orders, a pamphlet, a printed guideline, a URL. Others did not. The commercial incentive, as always, ran in the direction of selling more product rather than less, and the customers most likely to order frequently and in large quantities were not the careful, experienced users who would read the pamphlet. They were the ones who had watched the videos and wanted the most extreme version of the experience they had seen. The market peaked sometime around 2009 or 2010, then declined as state bans accumulated and the cultural moment moved on. Some vendors pivoted to other legal highs, synthetic cannabinoids, kratom, other botanical products that occupied the same legal grey zone. Others simply closed. The commercial infrastructure of the Salvia era dissolved fairly quickly once the demand dried up, leaving behind almost nothing. No corporate accountability, no documentation, no record of how much product had been sold to how many people at what potencies. The money had been made, the foil packets had been sent, and somewhere in the supply chain, between the cloud forest in Oaxaca, where the plant grew, and the bedroom in Ohio where it was smoked on camera, every thread of context, care and knowledge had been quietly stripped away. Let's watch it wind down. Because cultural moments do not end with announcements. They end with a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in attention, a thinning of the crowd, a slowing of the uploads, a comment section that stays quiet for a few days, and then a few weeks, and then indefinitely. By 2012 or so, the peak of the Salvia divinorum viral era had clearly passed. The videos were still there, archived on YouTube, preserved by the internet's remarkable memory, but the flood of new content had slowed. Several things had happened simultaneously, as endings usually require. State bans had made the substance harder to obtain in many parts of the country. YouTube's moderation policies had evolved, and some drug-related content had been removed or restricted, not systematically, but enough to reduce the visibility of new uploads. The media coverage had run its natural course. The news segments had been made, the congressional statements had been issued, the cultural conversation had moved on to other legal highs that were generating more alarming footage and more alarming headlines. Synthetic cannabinoids, the substances sold as Spice or K2, arrived in the early 2010s with a significantly more dangerous profile than Salvia divinorum and quickly absorbed the attention of both the media and the legislators. The culture had also simply moved on in the way that internet cultures move on, not because the subject was exhausted, but because novelty is the primary currency of online attention, and Salvia divinorum had been novel in 2007 and was no longer novel in 2012. The teenagers who had driven the initial wave of videos had grown up. The platform had changed around them, monetization had arrived, production values had risen. The era of raw webcam footage was giving way to something more polished and more deliberate. The specific aesthetic of the early Salvia videos, grainy, immediate, unrehearsed, belonged to a moment in YouTube's history that was already starting to feel dated. New creators were making content that looked different and sounded different and was about different things. The algorithm followed the audience. The audience had moved. What remained was the archive. Thousands of videos sitting in the long tail of YouTube's catalogue, still watchable, still searchable, still generating occasional views from people who came across them through a chain of recommendations or a late-night Wikipedia spiral. They aged interestingly. What had been contemporary and immediate in 2007 became, by 2015, a kind of time capsule. The bedrooms visible in the background, with their specific posters and their specific laptops and their specific aesthetic of that exact cultural moment, were as dateable as carbon. The slang in the comment sections placed them precisely. The videos had stopped being news and become history, quietly, without ceremony. the way most things become history. Not with a declaration, but with the slow realization that you are describing something that used to happen, rather than something that is happening now. Let's go inside the brain. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically, but into the actual neuroscience. Because the experience that millions of people watched on YouTube, and that thousands of them had themselves, was not random or mysterious. It was the predictable output of a specific compound acting on a specific receptor system in a specific way. Understanding it does not make it less strange. It makes it stranger. In research labs far removed from the webcam-lit bedrooms of YouTube, scientists were piecing together what was actually happening neurologically during a Salvia divinorum experience. The kappa opioid receptor system, the specific pathway that salvinorin A activates with such extraordinary potency, is distributed across brain regions involved in sensory processing, emotional regulation, memory, and the construction of what researchers call the sense of self. Unlike the mu-opioid receptors that painkillers and heroin act on, kappa opioid receptors, when strongly activated, tend to produce effects that are dysphoric rather than euphoric, meaning the baseline emotional tone of the experience is often one of strangeness, unease, or dissociation rather than pleasure. This is one reason Salvia divinorum never developed the kind of widespread recreational use associated with substances that feel good in a conventional sense. It is also one reason researchers found it interesting. The prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with executive function, decision-making, and the maintenance of a coherent sense of self across time, appears to be particularly affected by kappa opioid receptor activation. When this region is disrupted, the continuous narrative of being a particular person in a particular place in a particular moment begins to break down. The self is not a fixed object. It is an ongoing construction, assembled moment to moment by a brain that is constantly integrating sensory information, memory, and expectation into a coherent story. Salvinorin A, in sufficient doses, disrupts that assembly process so completely and so quickly that the story simply stops, mid-sentence, mid-thought, and something else begins. The something else is what the video showed from the outside, and what the trip reports described from the inside, and what the Mazatec healers had been navigating in the dark with chanting and intention for centuries. There is also the matter of the default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions that are active when the mind is at rest, when it is engaged in self-referential thought, when it is constructing the narrative of the self. Research into psychedelic substances over the past 2 decades has consistently found that substances which disrupt the default mode network produce experiences of ego dissolution, the dissolution of the sense of self that is common to mystical experiences, meditative states, and, it turns out, Salvia divinorum. The kappa opioid mechanism is different from the serotonergic mechanism of classical psychedelics, but the phenomenological endpoint, the temporary disappearance of the ordinary self, is recognizably similar. The Mazatec healers did not have MRI machines, but they had centuries of observational data about what this plant did to people and how to work with it safely. The neuroscience, arriving millennia later, was in many ways confirming what they already knew, which is, in its own way, a remarkable thing. Let's talk about what might have been. Because underneath the chaos of the viral era and the reactivity of the legislative response, there was a quieter story about a compound with genuine scientific interest, a story that the panic made significantly harder to tell. The list of conditions for which Salvia divinorum and its derivatives have been proposed as potential therapeutic tools is, by now, fairly long. Depression, addiction, chronic pain, and certain neurological disorders have all appeared in the research literature. The mechanism, kappa opioid receptor agonism, represents a genuinely novel pathway compared to existing pharmaceuticals, which means it might work in cases where existing treatments do not. Some of the most intriguing early research suggested that kappa opioid agonists might reduce cravings for cocaine and other stimulants, a finding with potentially enormous clinical significance given the scale of stimulant addiction and the absence of any FDA-approved pharmacological treatment for it. If you have a family member who has struggled with cocaine addiction and been told by their treatment provider that there are no medications that specifically address the craving, you have some sense of what a novel mechanism in that space might mean. The research was preliminary, but it was there. The depression research was equally interesting, if equally preliminary. The relationship between the kappa opioid system and mood regulation is complex and not fully understood, but there is evidence that dysregulation of this system plays a role in certain forms of depression, particularly the dysphoric and hedonic presentations that respond poorly to conventional antidepressants. Salvinorin A, or a synthesized derivative designed to preserve its therapeutic properties while reducing its disorienting ones, might offer a different angle of attack. Pharmaceutical chemists had begun exploring modified versions of the compound by the mid-2000s, molecules that retained the kappa opioid binding affinity without the complete dissociative effect, potentially allowing the therapeutic mechanism to be used without the 4 minutes of complete departure from reality that made clinical application impractical. This work was slow, expensive, and dependent on a regulatory environment that was becoming less hospitable by the year. The irony at the centre of this story is considerable. A plant with genuine scientific interest, used safely and deliberately by an indigenous tradition for centuries, became famous through a series of videos that were about the most dangerous and least deliberate way of engaging with it. The fame generated a panic. The panic generated legislation. The legislation made the research harder. The research that was made harder might have produced treatments for conditions that affect millions of people. The teenagers filming themselves in their bedrooms were not thinking about any of this. Neither, for the most part, was the legislative response. The question of what the plant might offer, handled carefully, in the right context by trained researchers, that question got quieter while the videos got louder. It has not gone away. It is still being asked in laboratories and conference rooms and grant applications by people who believe the answer is worth finding. They're just working harder to find it than they should have to. Let's think for a moment. Because Salvia divinorum, whatever else it is, has a habit of generating philosophical conversation, and not the vague, hand-wavy kind, but the specific, technical, genuinely difficult kind that philosophers of mind have been circling for decades. Philosophers of mind have a particular interest in Salvia divinorum, and it is not primarily about drug policy. The experience reliably produced by this plant, the dissolution of the sense of self, the replacement of ordinary reality with something qualitatively different, the temporary but complete severance from the narrative of personal identity, touches on some of the deepest and most contested questions in the philosophy of consciousness. What is the self? Where does it live? What happens when it temporarily stops? These are not new questions. They have been asked by philosophers, contemplatives, and mystics across cultures and centuries. But Salvia divinorum offers something unusual, a repeatable, fast-acting, chemically specific method of producing the experience these questions are about, which means it is, in a peculiar way, an experimental tool for investigating them. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger, who has written extensively about the neuroscience and philosophy of self-consciousness, has argued that the sense of self is not a thing but a model, a constantly updated representation that the brain constructs of itself, which it then mistakes for a stable, continuous entity. On this view, the experience of being a self is an illusion, not in the dismissive sense of being false, but in the precise sense of being a construction that conceals its own constructedness. Salvia divinorum on this reading is a chemical tool that briefly disrupts the construction process, revealing, for the duration of the experience, the assembled nature of what ordinarily feels like a given. Users who report the feeling of having always been elsewhere, of their ordinary life having been the dream and the salvia state the awakening, are, in Metzinger's framework, briefly glimpsing the machinery behind the curtain. The curtain usually conceals it. The plant removes it for 10 minutes, then it goes back. The Buddhist philosophical tradition has its own vocabulary for this. The doctrine of anatta, no self, holds that the sense of a continuous unified self is a cognitive error, a superimposition of continuity onto a stream of experience that is actually discontinuous. Meditation traditions that work toward insight into anatta spend years cultivating the direct experience of this discontinuity. Salvia divinorum, by several accounts, produces something that resembles that insight, compressed into a few minutes, without the scaffolding of the contemplative path, and with considerably more disorientation. Whether the resemblance is superficial or deep is a question that serious practitioners of both disciplines continue to debate. What is not in dispute is that the experience the plant produces is, for a significant number of the people who have it, genuinely philosophically destabilizing, not in a harmful sense, but in the specific sense of making ordinary assumptions about the nature of consciousness and self-feel afterward considerably less certain. The teenagers uploading videos were not for the most part thinking about Thomas Metzinger or anatta, but the experience they were having was connected to those questions, whether they knew it or not. Let's go back to the footage, because one of the stranger aspects of the Salvia divinorum viral era is that it happened at exactly the moment when human experience began to be systematically archived at scale, and that archive, for all its chaos and comedy, has turned out to be a remarkably durable historical record. YouTube has changed considerably since 2006, and so has its content moderation policy. A significant portion of the Salvia trip videos that drove the original viral wave have been removed, some for violating drug-related content policies, others simply lost to the ordinary attrition of deleted accounts and expired links. But many remain. The internet's memory is long and selective, and the Salvia era is well preserved enough to be studied by anyone who goes looking. Academic researchers studying drug culture and digital media have used these archived videos as primary sources, analysing the videos themselves, the comment sections, the patterns of sharing and response, to understand how drug culture spreads online, how platforms shape behaviour, and how the absence of context transforms something sacred into something reckless. The videos are, in this sense, historical documents as surely as any pamphlet or newspaper or legislative transcript. What is most striking about watching these videos now, from a distance of nearly 2 decades, is how completely they capture a specific moment in the history of the internet, a moment before monetization, before polished production values, before the self-consciousness that comes from knowing you are participating in an industry rather than just filming something that happened. The bedrooms in the background are dateable by their contents, specific laptop models, specific posters, specific versions of social media platforms visible on screens. The slang in the comment sections places them in time as precisely as a date stamp. The raw, unedited quality of the footage, the shaky camera, the ambient sound of a house, the friend's voice off-screen asking, "Are you okay?" belongs to a particular moment in media history that already feels genuinely distant, even though it was not very long ago. There is something unexpectedly moving about this archive, taken as a whole. These were mostly very young people, doing something impulsive and poorly considered, in the specific way that young people have always done impulsive and poorly considered things, except that this generation did it in front of a camera, at the beginning of an era that would make cameras ubiquitous, and so the record exists. You can watch them, you can read their comments, you can follow the links, the ones that still work, from the videos to the forum posts to the vendor pages to the news segments. The entire ecosystem of a cultural moment, preserved in amber, available for examination. The Mazatec healers didn't have cameras. Maria Sabina did not have a YouTube channel. The history of their tradition exists in fragments, in anthropological field notes and second-hand accounts and the memories of people who were there. The history of the Salvia viral era exists in extraordinary detail, archived on servers, searchable, watchable, permanent in the way that digital things are permanent, which is to say fragile and contingent, but also, so far, still there. Let's take stock, because the Salvia divinorum episode left marks on drug policy, on media culture, on the regulatory conversation about legal highs, and some of those marks are more visible than others. The Salvia divinorum episode of internet history did leave a mark on drug policy, though not always in the ways that reformers or researchers might have hoped. The state-level bans that accumulated through the late 2000s and early 2010s established a legal precedent for restricting plant-derived hallucinogens that had not previously been scheduled, a precedent that would later be invoked in discussions about other substances. The media coverage of the Salvia panic contributed to a broader cultural conversation about legal highs, grey market substances, and the limits of drug scheduling, a conversation that would intensify through the synthetic cannabinoid and bath salt scares of the early 2010s, which involved substances considerably more dangerous than Salvia divinorum, and produced a legislative response considerably faster than the one Salvia had generated. In this sense, the Salvia era was in part a rehearsal, a dry run for the regulatory and media response to subsequent legal high panics, with a slightly less urgent substance in the starring role. What the Salvia era did not produce was a serious, sustained public conversation about the Mazatec tradition, or a well-funded research program to explore the therapeutic potential of salvinorin A, or any meaningful reflection on why the combination of legal availability, internet culture, and absent context had produced the outcome it produced. Those conversations happened in academic papers and conference presentations and harm reduction circles, but they did not happen at the level of public policy in any durable way. The policy response was reactive: bans, restrictions, scheduling debates. The proactive question: how do you create a regulatory framework that allows responsible use, supports research, and respects the tradition the substance comes from, was not the question that got answered. It was barely the question that got asked. The broader legacy of the Salvia era in drug policy is perhaps most visible in the way it shaped the conversation about psychedelic research that would accelerate through the 2010s and into the 2020s. The renaissance of serious scientific interest in psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelic substances, which produced the first FDA-approved psychedelic-assisted therapy in the form of MDMA treatment for PTSD, happened in a climate partly shaped by what the Salvia era had demonstrated: that substances could become famous through the wrong channel, generate panic, and be legislated into inaccessibility before anyone had a chance to understand them properly. The researchers who drove the psychedelic renaissance were, in many cases, acutely aware of this risk and worked carefully to build public trust, emphasize therapeutic context, and avoid the spectacle that had defined the Salvia moment. They had learned something from watching that era unfold. The lesson was not comfortable, but it was legible, and it mattered. Let's go back to where we started. Back to the mountain. Back to the cloud forest. Back to the damp to the cloud forest. Back to the damp ravine where a large, soft-leaved, entirely unremarkable-looking plant grows in the mist, completely indifferent to its own history, In the Sierra Mazateca, in the damp ravines of the cloud forest where Salvia divinorum grows wild among the ferns and mosses, the plant is still there. It grew before the internet, it grew through the viral era, and it is growing now. The mist still moves through the trees in the morning. The river is still a thin silver thread. The cloud forest is still exactly as far from a YouTube comment section as it is possible to be. The plant does not know what happened to it between 2005 and 2012. It does not know about the foil packets or the smoke shops or the 60x extract or the congressional statements or the grainy webcam footage. It is a plant. It grows. It contains a compound. The compound does what it does. Everything else was human. The Mazatec healers who work with it are still there too, fewer in number than they once were, their traditions under pressure from modernity, from migration, from the long aftermath of the contact that began with Wasson's article in 1957 and has not stopped since. Some of them are aware of what happened to their plant during the YouTube years, their reactions, where they have been recorded by anthropologists and journalists who made the trip to the Sierra Mazateca to ask, tend to range from bewilderment to sorrow, to a kind of philosophical resignation that comes from having watched something sacred be repeatedly misunderstood by people who never thought to ask what it was. The plant they work with in ceremony, in darkness, with intention, with the full weight of a tradition behind every element of the ritual, is not the same plant that appears in the grainy videos, even though the leaves are chemically identical. Context is not a nicety. Context is the whole thing. The Mazatec have known this for centuries. There are younger Mazatec healers now who are engaged in a deliberate effort to document and preserve the tradition, to create a record of the ceremonial knowledge before it is lost to time, migration, and the specific modern pressures that make it harder for each generation to pass on what the previous one knew. Some of them are working with anthropologists and linguists. Some are working with organizations focused on indigenous intellectual property rights, which raises the question, a genuinely complicated and important question, of what it means for a tradition to own knowledge about a plant, and what protections might exist for that knowledge in a world that has demonstrated repeatedly its willingness to extract and decontextualize without asking. These efforts are not well funded. They are not widely known. They do not have viral videos. They are in that sense the opposite of the Salvia era, quiet, careful, deliberate, context-rich, which is perhaps exactly right. The plant grew in a quiet place. The tradition that understood it was quiet too. The noise came from elsewhere, and eventually the noise passed, and the plant and the tradition are still there, doing what they were always doing, waiting patiently for the world to become curious in a more useful way. Let's end where history always ends, not with a conclusion, because history resists conclusions, but with a reflection. Because the story of how millions of teenagers discovered the world's strongest hallucinogen on YouTube is, underneath everything, a story about something much larger than a plant. What we actually learned from the Salvia divinorum viral era, if we were paying attention, and many people were not, is something about the relationship between technology, knowledge, and context. The internet in its early years was celebrated as a democratizing force, a system that made information available to everyone, that removed the gatekeepers, that allowed anyone to know anything. This was true. It was also incomplete. What the internet made available was information without hierarchy, an enormous, undifferentiated flood of content in which a careful, peer-reviewed harm reduction guide competed for attention on exactly the same terms as a grainy video of someone trying to communicate with a wall. In that competition, the video won. Not because people are stupid, but because human attention, across history and cultures, has always been drawn to spectacle before it is drawn to nuance. The internet did not create that tendency. It just scaled it. The Salvia era also taught us something about the specific cost of stripping context from knowledge. The Mazatec healers had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated framework for working with a genuinely powerful substance, a framework built over centuries from careful observation, transmitted through practice rather than text, embedded in a cosmological and social structure that gave it meaning and safety. That framework was not transferable to a foil packet and a webcam. You could not extract the active compound and leave the wisdom behind and expect the same result. The result you got when you stripped everything except the chemical was the videos, 4 minutes of a person who had gone somewhere without any of the tools to navigate it, coming back confused and shaken and saying, "Can I have some water?" which is not without its own kind of pathos. And finally, the Salvia era taught us something about how societies decide what to do about things they do not understand. The response to a substance that was briefly, accidentally, chaotically famous was not curiosity. It was not research. It was not a conversation with the people who understood it best. It was legislation, the fastest available tool, applied reactively, in response to media coverage rather than evidence. Some of those laws were probably necessary, some of them made the research harder. None of them addressed the underlying question, which was not how do we ban this, but how did this happen? How did a sacred plant from a specific tradition end up in a smoke shop in Ohio with a not-for-human consumption label and a potency multiplier on the back? And what does it mean that nobody in that supply chain thought to ask whether that was a good idea? That question is still unanswered. It is, in a different form, still being asked. About different substances, on different platforms with different teenagers in different bedrooms. The plant changes. The structure of the story does not. And somewhere in the cloud forest, in the damp and the mist, the sage of the diviners grows on, unhurried, waiting for someone to finally ask it the right question. And so, here we are. At the end of a story that began in a cloud forest in Oaxaca, wound its way through centuries of careful ceremonial knowledge, passed through the hands of a banker with a notebook and a magazine, travelled across decades of earnest forum posts and botanical supply catalogues, and arrived, finally, in a bedroom somewhere in America, in front of a webcam, in the early years of the internet, where it briefly became the most chaotic thing on the most chaotic platform in the history of human communication. It is a strange story. It is a funny story, in places. It is also, if you sit with it long enough, a story about something genuinely sad, about the distance between knowledge and attention, between tradition and novelty, between the care that something deserves and the speed at which the modern world tends to move past it. Think about what we actually travelled through tonight. We started with a plant, a soft, green, entirely unremarkable looking plant growing in the midst of a mountain range most of the world has never heard of, tended by people whose relationship with it was so deep and so careful that it had taken centuries to develop. We watched that plant get discovered, extracted, decontextualized, packaged in foil, labelled not for human consumption, and uploaded to the internet, all within the span of about 50 years. 50 years to travel from a sacred ceremony in the dark to a grainy video, with 300,000 views and a comment section full of people typing in capital letters. History, when it moves fast, and it does not always move carefully. The Mazatec healers who developed the velada ceremony over centuries were not naive. They understood that the plant they worked with was powerful, that power without context was dangerous, and that the difference between medicine and harm was not in the leaf but in everything surrounding the leaf, the darkness, the silence, the guidance, the preparation, the intention, the human presence that held the space open and kept the person safe. They built all of that, carefully, over generations, because they respected what they were working with. Because respect, in the end, is what makes the difference between a sacred practice and a grainy video of someone trying to have a conversation with their own left hand. And that respect, that accumulated, hard-won, quietly transmitted respect, is not a small thing. It is one of the most remarkable things human beings do. Across cultures, across centuries, across every continent and every language, people have looked at the world around them, at plants, at animals, at the movements of stars and the turning of seasons, and developed frameworks for understanding and working with what they found, not just using it, working with it, in relationship with it, with care and with awareness that some things require more from you than others. The Mazatec did this with Salvia divinorum. They did it slowly and carefully, and they built something worth preserving. The fact that it was not preserved, or not fully, not in the moment it most needed to be, is a loss that extends beyond one plant and one tradition. It is a loss that tells us something about what we value and what we overlook, and how quickly we reach for the thing without stopping to understand where it came from. So tonight, as you settle into your clean and quiet bed, in your safe and familiar room, with the soft noise of the fan and the darkness behind your eyelids, maybe spare a thought for the curandera in the Sierra Mazateca, chanting in the dark, her voice a thread in the silence, holding space for someone who has gone somewhere difficult and needs to find their way back. She has been doing that work for a very long time. She did not need a camera. She did not need an audience. She did not need a comment section, or a like button, or a notification that her video was trending. She just needed the darkness and the plant and the knowledge passed down from hand to hand across centuries that some things are too important to rush, that some experiences require a container, that the container is not separate from the medicine, it is the medicine. And maybe spare a thought too for the teenagers, because they were just teenagers, curious and impulsive and alive, doing what teenagers have always done, which is reaching toward the edge of experience without quite knowing where the edge is. They were not malicious. They were not stupid. They were simply young in the specific way that young people have always been young, armed with access and energy and very little context, drawn to the extraordinary thing without a framework for receiving it. Every generation does this. Every generation finds its version of the edge and leans over it, usually without reading the safety guidelines first. Most of them turned out fine. Most of them watched the videos, or made the videos, or typed "doing this tonight, wish me luck Lamau," and then grew up and moved on and are now probably in their 30s, lying in their own quiet beds, thinking about something entirely different. The edge they leaned over became a memory, the memory became a story, and the story tonight became this, because that is what history is in the end. It is the accumulation of human moments, wise and foolish, careful and chaotic, sacred and absurd, preserved long enough to be understood, or at least long enough to be told. The Mazatec healers are part of that accumulation. Maria Sabina is part of it. The researchers in their laboratories are part of it. The teenagers with their webcams and their foil packets and their comment sections are part of it too. All of it, the whole strange tangle of it, belongs to the same story. The story of human beings encountering something powerful and trying to figure out what to do with it, sometimes wisely and sometimes not, always imperfectly, always with more confidence than the situation warranted. The plant is still there. The tradition is still there. The questions the plant raises about consciousness, about the self, about what it means to briefly lose the story of who you are and come back changed. Those questions are still there too, patient and unresolved, growing quietly in the mist of a mountain range in southern Mexico, waiting for the world to become curious in a more careful way. You have your bed, you have your blanket, you have the soft white noise of a fan and the knowledge that tomorrow morning you will wake up exactly where you fell asleep, with your sense of self intact, your walls where you left them, and no need whatsoever for a tripsitter. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Sleep well. You're exactly where you're supposed to be.